When the angriest man alive crashes into a dimension that feeds on fury, hell makes its first mistake. The walls pulse with hunger. The air tastes like copper and ash. Every demon that touches him makes him stronger, and hell just gave rage an infinite buffet. So what happens when the one thing that can't be controlled walks into the one place that refuses to break? The containment field shattered at 0347 hours, and with it, the last illusion that hell could be measured. Dr. Samuel Hayden stood in the observation deck of the Argent facility, his mechanical fingers tracing the fracture patterns spreading across holographic displays like cracks in reality itself. The dimensional breach had opened 3 kilometers beneath the Martian surface, where the Argent extraction towers pierced into Hell's outermost membrane. Energy readings spiked beyond calibration. Temperature sensors failed. Gravity itself seemed to recoil from what was emerging through the wound between worlds. He watched the numbers climb, watched the impossible mathematics of the breach rewrite themselves with each passing second, and understood that something had crossed over that should not exist in any rational universe. The readings carried a signature he had never encountered in all his years manipulating the barriers between dimensions. Not demonic, not human, something that registered as biological but burned with an intensity that rivaled pure Argent concentration. His sensors tracked a mass displacement consistent with a single organism, yet the energy output suggested a small sun compressed into flesh. The facility's defensive systems screamed warnings in languages he had programmed himself, alerts cascading across every monitor, each one more urgent than the last. Deep beneath the complex, where Hell's architecture met human engineering, something had arrived that treated the laws of physics as suggestions rather than absolutes. Samuel Hayden had long since abandoned the limitations of human fear, had traded flesh for metal and mortality for purpose, but in this moment he felt something close to awe. The breach stabilizers were failing, the Argent collectors were overloading, and whatever had entered Hell was moving with a velocity that suggested neither caution nor confusion, only rage given direction and form. Hell noticed. The realm stirred like an ocean sensing blood, its vast consciousness spreading through dimensions that humans had barely begun to map. Demons poured toward the anomaly in waves, summoned by instinct older than stars, driven by hunger that predated time itself. They came in thousands, then tens of thousands, a tide of corruption and teeth and ancient malice flowing through Hell's twisted corridors toward the disturbance. The realm's architecture shifted to accommodate the gathering swarm, passages widening, gravity reversing, space folding to deliver maximum violence to the intruder. Samuel watched the demonic convergence through Hellside cameras that barely survived the Argent radiation. The creatures moved with the certainty of predators who had never known defeat in their own domain, who had torn apart dimensions and fed on civilizations beyond counting. They expected prey. They expected meat. They expected another soul to corrupt and consume in Hell's endless feast of damnation. They found something else entirely. The first wave hit like a tsunami against a mountain. Dr. Bruce Banner did not remember crossing over, did not remember the accident in the UAC experimental portal lab, did not recall the gamma radiation surge that had torn through the dimensional stabilizers at the exact moment the Hell breach opened. His last clear memory was of equations spiraling beyond solution, of energy readings that defied every law he had spent his life mastering, and then the familiar sensation of his consciousness fragmenting as something older and infinitely angrier rose to meet the threat. The Hulk emerged into Hell with fists already swinging. The realm tried to unmake him immediately, tried to flood his cells with corruption, tried to rewrite his biology into something that could be controlled and consumed. Hell had broken gods before, had shattered titans and dragged angels down into darkness until they forgot the very concept of light. It poured its essence into this new arrival, expecting the usual transformation from victim to monster, from prey to servant. Instead, the corruption ignited. Hulk cells absorbed the demonic energy and converted it into pure rage, into muscle density that exceeded any natural limit, into strength that compounded with every attempted violation of his being. Hell was trying to fuel him. Every wave of corruption made him stronger. Every attempt to transform him added mass to his frame, added layers of indestructible tissue, added depth to the endless well of fury that defined his existence. The radiation in his blood, the gamma signature that had created him, reacted with Hell's energy like antimatter touching matter, producing an escalation that neither force could control. He grew. The first demon to reach him was a Hell Knight, 3 meters of scaled muscle and diabolic rage that had crushed continents. It swung a clawed fist with enough force to shatter tanks. Hulk caught the blow in one massive green hand and felt the bones inside the demon's arm compress to powder. He lifted the creature by its shattered limb and brought it down against Hell's stone floor with enough force to create a crater 15 meters wide. The Hell Knight's body exploded into fragments of armor and ichor, painting the scorched ground in patterns that steamed in the superheated air. The other demons paused for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then they surged forward in a wave of teeth and claws and ancient hunger, and Hulk met them with a roar that shook Hell's foundations. He moved through them like an avalanche through a forest, each impact creating shockwaves that rippled through the demonic horde. Imps died by the dozen, their bodies pulverized by backhand strikes that generated sonic booms. Cacodemons burst like overripe fruit when his fists connected with their bloated forms, spraying acidic blood that hissed against his skin and only made him angrier. He grabbed a mancubus by its cybernetic arms and tore it in half, using the separated pieces as clubs to beat down the demons still pressing forward, still trying to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. They could not understand what they were fighting. Demons knew rage. Hell itself was built on rage, on the concentrated fury of damned souls and fallen angels, on the cosmic anger of beings cast down from grace. But this was different. This was rage without ideology, without purpose beyond its own expression. Rage that did not seek to corrupt or convert, but simply to destroy everything that threatened it. The Hulk had no interest in ruling Hell, no desire to claim its throne or reshape its hierarchies. He wanted only to break everything that stood in front of him, to reduce every demon to pulp and every structure to rubble, to express through violence the fundamental rejection of everything this realm represented. Hell tried to contain him. Portals opened beneath his feet, trying to drop him into deeper levels where the architecture itself was weaponized, where gravity reversed and space folded into killing geometries. He fell through one portal and crashed into a chamber where the walls were made of living bone, where the ceiling dripped acid and the floor was a sea of flames. Demons waited there, an ambush of Hell barons armed with weapons forged in the oldest furnaces of damnation. They attacked in perfect coordination, a tactical strike meant to overwhelm even the strongest opponent. Hulk caught the first baron's blade in his hand, the metal sinking into his palm, drawing thick green blood that hissed and steamed. He felt the pain as a distant thing, another sensation to convert into fury, another reason to hit harder. He yanked the sword free from the demon's grip and drove it through 3 other barons in a single thrust, pinning them to the bone wall like specimens on display. The impaled demons shrieked, their bodies beginning to dissolve, and Hulk grabbed the nearest baron's horned skull and drove it into the floor repeatedly, until the stone beneath gave way, and they fell into an even deeper chamber. The descent took them through layers of Hell's architecture, through ceilings that became floors and floors that became ceilings, through spaces where the laws of physics were suggestions written in languages that predated human mathematics. Hulk and the Baron tumbled through madness, through chambers where screaming faces emerged from walls to witness their passage, where rivers of molten souls flowed upward in defiance of gravity, where the very concept of direction became meaningless. They crashed into a cathedral of bone and brass, a structure so vast that its ceiling disappeared into darkness that predated light. The impact created a crater that shattered ancient architecture, sent fragments of demon-forged metal spinning into the darkness. The Baron beneath Hulk's hands finally stopped moving, its skull compressed to the thickness of paper, its body nothing more than a spreading stain. Hulk stood. Around him, the cathedral came alive. Thousands of demons had been waiting here, had been gathering for some ritual or convergence, and now they turned their attention to the intruder. Imps clung to the walls like insects. Cacodemons floated in formations that suggested military precision. Hell Knights and Barons formed ranks, their weapons gleaming with argent energy. At the far end of the cathedral, something massive stirred, something that made even the other demons retreat slightly, creating space for its emergence. A titan. The creature rose from beneath the floor like a mountain achieving consciousness, each movement releasing clouds of ash and embers, each breath creating winds that scattered lesser demons like leaves. Its body was a fusion of flesh and metal, biology and engineering merged through eons of hell's corrupting influence. Eyes like burning stars regarded Hulk with an intelligence that was purely malevolent, an awareness that had watched civilizations rise and fall and burn. The Titan had killed gods. It raised one massive fist, and reality itself seemed to compress around the motion, air becoming solid, space becoming viscous. The blow descended with the weight of collapsing stars, with force enough to crack planets, with the certainty of something that had never been resisted successfully. Hulk caught it. His feet sank into the stone floor, driving down through layers of ancient architecture, creating shockwaves that radiated outward in perfect circles. His legs compressed, absorbing impact that should have liquefied any biological organism, converting the kinetic energy into something else, something that fed back into his cellular structure and made him denser, harder, stronger. The Titan's fist was the size of a building. Hulk's hands looked almost small against its scaled surface, but he held it motionless, muscles corded like steel cables, tendons standing out against green skin that was beginning to darken with the sheer concentration of power flowing through his body. The Titan tried to pull back, could not. Its eyes widened in something that might have been the first doubt it had experienced in eons. Hulk twisted. The sound of the Titan's arm breaking was like a mountain splitting, a crack that echoed through dimensions, that reverberated through hell's architecture and made ancient structures shudder. The creature's roar was pain-given voice, was the sound of something immortal experiencing mortality for the first time in countless ages. It staggered back, cradling its ruined limb, and Hulk pursued with the relentlessness of an avalanche, with the inevitability of entropy itself. He leaped. The jump carried him 50 meters vertically, carried him on a trajectory that intersected with the Titan's skull. His fist met demonic bone at terminal velocity, met it with all the rage and strength and compressed fury of a being who existed only to break things that tried to hurt him. The impact created a shockwave, visible as a sphere of distorted air, created thunder that deafened every demon in the cathedral, created a moment of perfect silence in the instant before the Titan's head exploded. The body stood for 3 full seconds, brain destroyed but biology too massive to realize it was dead. Then it toppled forward, and the impact when it hit the cathedral floor was like an earthquake, like the planet itself, rejecting the corpse of something that had offended physics for too long. Dust and fragments of bone and chunks of corrupted flesh rained down across the entire chamber. The demons attacked. They came from every direction at once, from above and below, and from angles that should not have existed in 3-dimensional space. They came with the desperation of predators who had finally recognized prey that could end them, with the fury of a realm that was being defied in its own domain. They came in numbers that would have overwhelmed armies, that had overwhelmed armies across countless worlds and dimensions. Hulk destroyed them all. He fought without technique, without strategy, with nothing but pure physical dominance expressed through violence that grew more intense with each passing second. Every demon that touched him made him angrier. Every wound they inflicted healed instantly and left him stronger. Every drop of his blood that hit hell's floor hissed and steamed and ate into the stone like acid, like something that hell itself could not fully process or contain. An archvile emerged from a portal wreathed in flames, its skeletal form radiating heat that melted stone and boiled flesh. It raised burning hands and summoned pillars of fire that would have incinerated anything mortal. Columns of flame so intense they burned white, so hot they existed at temperatures that exceeded the surface of suns. The fire washed over Hulk, and he walked through it, his skin blackening and cracking, and regenerating faster than the flames could consume him, his body adapting to the heat and converting it into fuel for his rage. He grabbed the archvile by its burning skull and drove it into the ground hard enough to create a crater, then began pounding it with fists that moved faster than the flames could regenerate its body. Each impact drove the demon deeper into the stone, each blow compressed its form further, until finally there was nothing left but ash and the fading memory of heat. A summoner appeared on a floating platform of bone, its body covered in glyphs that glowed with argent energy. It chanted in languages that preceded human evolution, languages that could reshape reality through pure will and concentrated demonic power. Portals opened around Hulk, disgorging more demons, creating a tactical situation designed to overwhelm through coordination and endless reinforcement. Hulk grabbed a Hell Knight's severed arm from the ground and threw it. The improvised projectile crossed the cathedral in less than a second, moving at hypersonic velocity, trailing fire from atmospheric friction. It struck the summoner dead center, and the demon exploded, its concentration shattered, its spells unraveling, its portals collapsing in cascades of dimensional backlash that consumed the demons already emerging through them. Samuel Hayden watched it all from his monitoring station, watched the Hulk reduce Hell's infinite hordes to manageable numbers through simple, brutal efficiency. His processors calculated combat metrics, analyzed force generation, attempted to model the biological impossibility he was witnessing. The Hulk should not exist, should not be able to grow stronger indefinitely, should not be able to violate thermodynamics so casually, generating more energy than he consumed, creating matter from nowhere as his body expanded to meet each new threat. Yet here was the evidence, undeniable and measurable. Every demon destroyed seemed to feed something in the Hulk's cellular structure. Every injury healed stronger. Every moment of combat pushed him further beyond any rational limit. Hayden's sensors tracked gamma radiation spiking in patterns that suggested intelligence, as if the energy itself was learning, adapting, finding new ways to enhance and protect its host. And beneath all the measurements and analysis, Samuel Hayden recognized something that made his mechanical heart beat faster. The Hulk was winning. Not surviving. Not enduring. Winning. Against hell itself. Against infinite numbers and ancient power and corruption that had broken entire realities. He was reducing Hell's cathedral to rubble, and Hell could not stop him. The demons began to retreat, not in coordination, not with tactical purpose, but with the pure instinct of predators who had finally encountered something higher on the food chain. They fled through portals, fled into the deeper darkness, fled from the green giant who stood in the center of a crater filled with demonic remains, and looked around for more things to destroy. Hulk roared at their retreat, a sound of pure frustration that the violence was ending, that there was nothing left immediately in front of him to break. The roar echoed through the cathedral, through the passages beyond, through layers of Hell's architecture until it reached chambers where things older than demons stirred in recognition. Hell's lords heard. In the necropolis, where the greatest demons dwelt in palaces built from the bones of dead gods, the Dread Knights gathered. In the foundries, where weapons were forged from condensed suffering, the Hell Priests turned their attention to the disturbance. In the deepest pits, where reality frayed and madness pooled like water, ancient things that had no names in human languages began to move upward, drawn by the promise of prey that could actually satisfy their endless hunger. Hell was mobilizing its true strength, and in a chamber beyond space, beyond time, beyond the reach of mortal understanding, the Doomslayer opened his eyes. He had been resting, healing, preparing for the next crusade against Hell's endless legions. But now, something had changed. Something had entered the realm that carried an energy signature he had never encountered. Something that was killing demons with an efficiency that approached his own. Something that made Hell itself recoil in a way he had only seen when he walked these burning corridors himself. The Slayer stood, his armor's systems coming online, ancient runes glowing with power that predated the current universe. He reached for his weapons, felt their familiar weight, felt the eagerness in the blessed metal to taste demon flesh again. The Praetor suit's diagnostic scrolled across his visor, showing full combat readiness, showing Argent reserves at maximum, showing all the systems that had been enhanced by Seraphim blessing and refined through eons of warfare. Vega's voice whispered through his helmet's communication array. the AI's tone carrying something that might have been concern if artificial intelligences could truly feel such things. The Slayer did not respond. Did not need to. He had walked through hell for ages beyond counting, had killed every demon that stood before him, had torn apart the realm's architecture and scattered its lords. If something new had entered this place, something strong enough to disturb hell's deepest foundations, then it was either an ally to be protected or an enemy to be destroyed. He would know which when they met. The Slayer stepped through a portal of his own making, through a tear in reality that his armor's systems could generate after so long spent navigating hell's dimensional labyrinths. The portal deposited him on a ridge overlooking the cathedral where Hulk stood alone among the ruins of his rampage, where demon corpses carpeted the ground in layers thick enough to obscure the stone beneath, where the air itself was thick with ash and the lingering scent of violence. For a long moment, the two figures simply regarded each other across the distance. Two beings who should not exist, two forces shaped by rage and pain and endless combat into something beyond human, beyond demon, beyond any category that had language to describe it. The Slayer saw the Hulk's stance, the way he stood ready for more violence, the way his body radiated barely contained fury. The Hulk saw the Slayer's armor, saw the weapons, saw something in the way this new arrival held himself that suggested he had never retreated from anything in his entire existence. Neither moved. The moment stretched. Hell held its breath. Even the ever-present sounds of distant screaming and grinding machinery seemed to quiet, as if the entire realm was waiting to see what would happen when these two met, when unstoppable met immovable, when infinite rage met eternal fury. Then Hulk growled, a sound that started deep in his chest and built until it became almost a word, almost a challenge, almost a question. The Slayer's hand moved to his shoulder, closed around the grip of the super shotgun mounted there. Not a threat. Not yet. But ready. Always ready. Hulk's fists clenched, knuckles cracking, muscles tensing, body preparing for violence because violence was all he knew in moments like this, because everything that looked at him the way the Slayer was looking at him either feared him or wanted to hurt him, and nothing in Hulk's experience suggested any other possibilities existed. The Slayer released the shotgun, let his hand fall to his side, made a choice that spoke through action rather than words, that said in the only language both of them truly understood, "Not now, not here, not until we know what you are." Hulk's growl diminished slightly. Confusion flickered across his massive features, an expression that looked almost human despite the size and rage and power radiating from every cell. Something in him recognized a kindred thing, recognized another being shaped entirely by combat, another existence defined by the simple act of breaking everything that threatened it. They stood in the ruins of the cathedral and studied each other while hell waited to see which way the moment would break. Then, the ground beneath them shattered. The Dread Knights came through the floor in a coordinated assault. 10 of hell's finest warriors attacking in perfect synchronization, attacking both Hulk and the Slayer simultaneously, because hell had decided in its vast and ancient consciousness that these two threats could not be allowed to exist together, could not be permitted to discover if they were allies or enemies without hell's interference. The knights rose on jets of flame, their armor forged in furnaces that had consumed galaxies, their weapons blessed by entities that predated the concept of blessing. They moved with the precision of beings who had trained for eons, who had perfected the art of killing through countless campaigns across infinite dimensions. 5 targeted Hulk. 5 targeted the Slayer. The division was meant to separate them, to prevent any possibility of coordination, to ensure that hell's finest could destroy each threat individually before any alliance could form. Hulk grabbed the first knight out of the air and slammed it into the second, creating an impact that fused their armored bodies together. He spun with them, using their combined mass as a weapon, and smashed them into the third knight hard enough to send all 3 tumbling through the cathedral wall and out into the burning wasteland beyond. The Slayer drew his shotgun and fired twice, both shells finding the gaps in demonic armor that only he seemed to see, both shots placed with precision that came from experience measured in eternities. 2 knights exploded, their bodies coming apart in sprays of ichor and shattered metal. He discarded the spent shotgun and drew his blade in the same motion, met the third knight's charge with a parry that redirected the demon's momentum into the ground, then drove the crucible through its spine before it could recover. The remaining knights regrouped, reassessing, calculating new strategies. They had expected to fight two separate opponents. Instead, they faced two forces that were now moving with an awareness of each other, with an implicit coordination born from mutual respect of pure combat efficiency. Hulk charged toward the knights, attacking the Slayer. Not because he cared about the armored figure, not because he felt any kinship or alliance, but because more targets had appeared and they were all Hell's creatures, and Hulk wanted to destroy them all without discrimination or preference. The Slayer saw the green giant thundering toward his position and made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. He grabbed one of the knights by its horned helmet and threw it directly into Hulk's path. Not an attack, an offering, a target delivered precisely where the Hulk's trajectory would intersect with it at maximum velocity. Hulk's fist met the airborne demon in mid-stride, and the knight simply ceased to exist, its body compressed beyond the point where matter could maintain coherence, transformed into a cloud of particles that dispersed across the cathedral like mist. The Slayer nodded once, a gesture so small it was almost invisible. Acknowledgement. Appreciation. The beginning of something that was not quite alliance but was definitely not opposition. They fought. Not together. Not with coordination or planning or any kind of tactical cooperation. But they fought in the same space, destroying the same enemies, and in doing so created a kind of terrible synergy. The Slayer's precision and Hulk's raw power overlapped in ways that made each more effective. When Hulk threw a demon across the cathedral, the Slayer was already positioned to intercept it with a blade strike that ended its existence. When the Slayer's weapons needed to reload, Hulk was there to provide a moment's breathing space by simply smashing everything within reach. The Dread Knights died screaming, died so fast they barely had time to scream, died with the realization that they had made a fundamental mistake, that bringing these two forces together even in combat had created something Hell could not overcome through simple strength or numbers. The last knight tried to flee, tried to open a portal and escape back to the necropolis to warn the lords about what it had witnessed. Hulk's hand closed around its ankle just as the portal began to form. He dragged it back through dimensional space, like pulling a fish from water, pulled it away from safety, and slammed it into the ground repeatedly until the portal collapsed and the knight was nothing more than a smear on the cathedral floor. Silence fell. Hulk and the Slayer stood 15 meters apart, surrounded by the remains of Hell's elite warriors, both covered in demon blood and ash, both breathing heavily not from exhaustion but from the sheer intensity of violence they had just expressed. The Slayer raised one hand, pointed at himself, pointed at the Hulk, then pointed toward the depths of Hell, toward where the realm's darkest corridors led down into the necropolis and beyond, into places where the strongest demons dwelt, where Hell's true power gathered and waited. Hulk understood. The armored figure was asking a question without words. Are we going to fight each other? Or are we going to fight them? For a long moment, Hulk said nothing. His mind, when it existed in this state, was not complex, did not traffic in nuance or subtlety, understood the world through simple categories, threat or not threat, break or not break. But something in the way the Slayer stood, something in the efficiency with which he killed demons, something in the simple fact that he had not attacked Hulk when he easily could have, created a category that Hulk's experience rarely encountered. Not threat, not friend either, something else. Hulk pointed deeper into Hell, growled an affirmation that was more feeling than language, more intention than words. The Slayer nodded. They moved deeper into Hell together, and reality trembled at the implications. Samuel Hayden's monitoring systems tracked their descent through Hell's layers, watched them carve a path through demonic forces that had stood unconquered for eons. His processors worked overtime attempting to calculate the strategic implications, to model what it meant that the Doomslayer and this new anomaly were moving in the same direction with what appeared to be mutual purpose, if not outright alliance. The mathematics were terrifying. The Slayer alone had nearly destroyed Hell multiple times. had killed titans and lords, and shattered the realm's infrastructure so thoroughly that it had taken centuries to rebuild. The Hulk, in just hours since his arrival, had demonstrated power that rivaled the Slayer's own, strength that seemed to have no upper limit, rage that fed on Hell's corruption and grew stronger with each battle. Together, they represented something unprecedented, something that Hell's ancient consciousness had never encountered and had no protocols to address. Hayden opened communication channels to the deepest parts of the UAC facility, to laboratories where scientists studied dimensional physics and Argent manipulation. His voice, when it came through their speakers, carried an urgency that made them stop their work and listen. In the necropolis, the Hell priests gathered in emergency conclave, their robes trailing smoke, their staffs crackling with concentrated Argent energy. They had watched the cathedral battle through scrying portals, had witnessed the impossible alliance, and now they conferred in languages that hurt reality to speak, debating responses that ranged from full retreat to apocalyptic escalation. The eldest among them, a creature that had witnessed the birth of stars and the death of universes, spoke with a voice like grinding stones. It reminded the others that Hell had survived every threat in its infinite existence, had outlasted gods and absorbed their power, had turned every attack against it into fuel for its own expansion. These two new threats, however powerful, were still finite, still mortal in some fundamental way, still subject to forces that Hell had mastered eons before their births. The priests began to weave a summoning, pulling power from Hell's deepest wells, channeling corruption that had been condensed over epochs into forms that could be weaponized. They would create something specifically designed to counter the Slayer and the Hulk, something that combined Hell's most advanced understanding of both Argent manipulation and biological corruption, something that would adapt to their strengths and exploit their weaknesses. They would build a perfect hunter. Hulk and the Slayer descended through layers of Hell that became increasingly hostile, increasingly alien to anything approaching human experience. They walked through forests where the trees were made of screaming faces, where the ground was soft with compressed souls, where the sky was a membrane that pulsed with diseased light. They crossed rivers of blood that flowed upward, defying gravity through sheer malevolence, that reached out with tendril-like currents to drag them down into drowning darkness. Demons attacked constantly, not in organized waves but in desperate ambushes, in opportunistic strikes, in the frantic actions of predators who knew they were being hunted. Imps sniped from distant cliffs and were rewarded with thrown boulders that turned them into paste. Hell Knights charged from concealment and were met with shotgun blasts or fists that pulverized armor and flesh with equal efficiency. Cacodemons descended from above and were torn apart, their acidic blood raining down but finding no purchase on skin and armor that had endured worse. The Slayer moved with economy, with precision that wasted no motion, killed with the minimum force necessary to end demonic existence. Hulk moved with excess, with overwhelming power that destroyed demons and landscape both, that reshaped Hell's architecture through simple application of strength to obstacles in his path. They made a strange contrast, traveling through Hell side by side, one a focused blade, the other a blunt hammer, both equally effective, both equally relentless. They came to a chasm that split Hell's landscape for kilometers in every direction. A wound in reality so deep that looking into it caused pain, caused the eyes to rebel against trying to focus on depths that predated the concept of depth. Ancient bridges spanned the gap, structures built from fused bones and blessed with dark rituals that kept them suspended over the infinite drop. The Slayer stepped onto the nearest bridge without hesitation. His armor's sensors showed structural integrity, showed the ancient architecture could support his weight despite its apparent fragility. He moved quickly, knowing that staying still in Hell was invitation to ambush, knowing that hesitation was death in this realm where even the ground beneath your feet might be alive and hungry. Hulk followed, his footsteps making the bridge groan, making the bones creak and shift. He was heavier than the Slayer by several orders of magnitude, heavy enough that the bridge began to sag, began to crack, began to show signs of imminent collapse. He sped up, moving faster, and his increased pace only stressed the structure more, created resonance that made the entire span begin to shake. Halfway across, the bridge gave way. Both of them fell into the chasm, into darkness that was not the absence of light but the presence of something that consumed light, that fed on illumination and grew stronger from its extinction. They fell through space that twisted around them, through air that became thick and resistant like falling through syrup, through layers of reality that each had different rules about what falling meant or which direction was down. Hulk roared, the sound swallowed by the darkness, his rage finding no target, no enemy to strike, only the endless descent into nothing. He flailed, trying to grab something, anything, but the chasm walls were smooth and impossibly distant, beyond reach, beyond any hope of arresting his fall. The Slayer fired his jump pack, the blessed technology, responding instantly, generating thrust that slowed his descent, that gave him control over his trajectory. He oriented himself in the darkness, his visor's enhanced vision cutting through the murk to map the chasm's dimensions, to plot trajectories and calculate impact velocities. He saw the Hulk falling beside him, saw the green giant spinning out of control, and made another decision that would have been impossible to explain if anyone had asked. He maneuvered closer. Hulk's hand lashed out instinctively when the armored figure approached, pure reflex driving him to grab onto anything, to find purchase in the void. His fingers closed around the Slayer's arm, grip tight enough to crumple steel, tight enough to shatter bone if the armor had not been reinforced with Argent Blessed alloys and Seraphim engineering. The Slayer's jump pack screamed in protest, thrusters overloading as they tried to support both masses, tried to slow their combined descent enough to make landing survivable. Warning lights flashed across his visor. Temperature gauges spiked as the jets burned at maximum output. Structural integrity alerts warned that his armor might fail before they reached bottom. He did not let go. They hit the chasm floor together at terminal velocity, hit it with combined force that created a crater visible from the rim kilometers above, that sent shockwaves radiating through Hell's foundations, that momentarily disrupted the realm's gravity in a sphere 50 meters in diameter. The Slayer's armor absorbed most of the impact, distributed it across its blessed frame, converted kinetic energy into heat and light and brief flashes of argent discharge. Hulk absorbed the rest through simple indestructibility, through cellular structure that treated physics as a polite suggestion, through rage that refused to acknowledge limits. They stood in the crater's center, covered in dust, surrounded by cracks that spider-webbed across the chasm floor like shattered glass. The Slayer's jump pack was dead, burned out from overload, useless until he could reach a UAC facility for repairs. Hulk was breathing heavily, more from anger at falling than from any physical strain, his body already healing the minor contusions and stress fractures that came from hitting solid ground at hypersonic velocity. Hulk released the Slayer's arm. For a moment they stood very close, close enough that the Slayer could see his own reflection in the Hulk's eyes, could see the rage swirling in those depths like a storm that had no beginning and would have no end. And Hulk could see through the Slayer's visor, could see eyes that held a different kind of fury, cold where his was hot, focused where his was diffuse, but no less intense, no less absolute. The Slayer nodded once. Not gratitude exactly, not friendship, but acknowledgement that Hulk had not attacked him when they touched, had not used the moment of vulnerability to try to establish dominance or resolve the question of which of them was stronger. Hulk grunted, turned away, started walking deeper into the chasm, following the only passage that led away from the crater, following it because it led down, and down was where more demons would be waiting, and demons were what Hulk wanted to find, so he could hit them until they stopped moving. The Slayer followed, his armor's self-repair systems already working on the jump pack, already cataloging damage and plotting repairs. Behind them, high above on the chasm's rim, demons gathered to watch their descent, gathered to report back to the necropolis that the two threats had survived the fall, had emerged from darkness together, and were now moving deeper into Hell's lowest levels, where the oldest things dwelt and the realm's true nature was laid bare. Hell's lords conferred in their palaces of bone and brass, and what they decided would reshape the war for existence itself. The passage through the chasm's depths led them into the foundries, into Hell's industrial heart, where weapons were forged and demons were manufactured through processes that violated every natural law. The air was thick with smoke and ash, and the screams of things being unmade and remade into forms more useful to Hell's eternal war. Conveyor belts carried body parts toward fusion chambers. Assembly lines stretched into darkness, staffed by imps and soldiers working with the mindless efficiency of those who had forgotten they had ever been anything other than tools. The Slayer had destroyed the foundries before, had sabotaged their production, had killed the overseers, and shattered the machinery. But Hell had rebuilt, had always rebuilt, had learned from each destruction, and made the systems more resilient, more distributed, harder to disrupt through any single act of sabotage. He and Hulk emerged onto a catwalk overlooking the main production floor, a space so vast its walls disappeared into haze, so loud that sound became a physical pressure. Below them, thousands of demons worked in synchronized patterns, tending furnaces the size of buildings, operating presses that could compress souls into weapons, managing flows of argent energy that would have incinerated anything mortal. Every demon on the floor looked up simultaneously, their work stopping in perfect synchronization as Hell's collective consciousness registered the intrusion and directed its servants to respond. The Slayer assessed the tactical situation in seconds. Too many enemies for any frontal assault to succeed quickly. Environmental factors favored the defenders. High ground advantage nullified by the sheer number of opponents who could attack from below and all sides. Standard doctrine would be to retreat, find a more defensible position, engage in guerrilla tactics to wear down the opposition over time. Hulk jumped off the catwalk. The leap carried him down to the production floor 30 meters below, carried him into the center of the densest concentration of demons, into the exact position where he would be surrounded and overwhelmed by sheer numbers. He landed with an impact that crumpled the metal floor, that sent ripples through the solid surface like dropping a stone in water. Demons surged toward him from all directions, a living tide of teeth and claws and cybernetic enhancement. They came in thousands, came with weapons designed to kill gods, came with the absolute certainty that no single being could stand against such numbers. Hulk proved them wrong. He fought like a hurricane given flesh, like a natural disaster that happened to be shaped like a man. His fists moved faster than the demons could track, each blow creating sonic booms, each impact sending shockwaves through the crowd. He grabbed demons by whatever he could reach and used them as weapons, swinging Hell Knights into groups of imps, throwing soldiers into cacodemons, creating cascades of destruction where every action killed multiple targets. The Slayer watched for exactly 3 seconds, calculated that Hulk was actually handling the situation, that the Green Giant's power-to-rage ratio was escalating faster than the demons could compensate for, that intervention was unnecessary from a tactical standpoint. Then he jumped anyway. Not because Hulk needed help, but because there were demons down there and demons needed to die, and standing on a catwalk watching someone else kill them was not the Slayer's way, had never been his way, would never be his way, no matter how old he got or how many eons he spent in this burning realm. He descended into the chaos and began his own work, surgical strikes between Hulk's broader devastation, precision kills in the gaps where Hulk's rampage created momentary openings. They carved through the foundry floor like opposing forces of nature, like fire and flood working from different directions toward the same goal of total destruction. The furnaces began to rupture as the fighting damaged control systems, as Argent containment failed, as failsafes designed to prevent catastrophic overload were destroyed by stray gunfire and bodies thrown through delicate machinery. Molten metal began to pour from cracked vessels, toxic gases vented from broken seals. The entire foundry started to come apart, its careful balance of hellish engineering collapsing into entropy as 2 unstoppable forces fought without any regard for the infrastructure around them. An alarm began to wail, a sound that hurt to hear, that carried frequencies designed to penetrate dimensional barriers and warn all of Hell that something catastrophic was occurring. Demons began to flee, abandoning their posts, running from the spreading destruction as the foundry's systems cascaded into failure. Hulk grabbed one of the fleeing demons and threw it into a furnace. The impact shattered the containment completely, released a wave of molten argent that washed across the production floor like a tsunami of liquid light. The substance was concentrated enough to kill most demons on contact, to burn through their corruption-enhanced bodies faster than they could regenerate, to reduce them to ash and screaming. The Slayer saw the wave coming and ran, not away but perpendicular to its spread, staying ahead of the advancing edge, while cutting down demons too slow or stupid to flee. His armor's temperature sensors screamed warnings but held, the blessed metal resisting heat that would have vaporized lesser materials. Hulk stood in the molten argent and let it wash over him. The substance tried to burn him, tried to consume his flesh, tried to break down his cellular structure the way it broke down demons. His skin blackened and cracked. Gamma radiation began to pour from the wounds, began to react with the argent in ways that Samuel Hayden's distant sensors could barely measure, could barely believe. The Hulk was absorbing it. His body was taking the argent energy and converting it, processing it through whatever impossible biology had created him, transforming it from a weapon of hell into fuel for his own rage. He grew larger, muscles expanding, skin darkening from green to a deeper shade that was almost black, eyes beginning to glow with light that was both gamma radiation and argent energy fused into something new. The transformation took seconds. When it was complete, Hulk stood in the center of the molten pool, nearly 3 meters tall, his body radiating power that made the air shimmer, that created distortions in local gravity, that caused the argent itself to flow away from him, as if even hell's most concentrated energy recognized something it could not overcome. The Slayer saw this and felt something he had not experienced in countless ages of warfare: uncertainty. Not fear. He was beyond fear, had killed it along with every other weakness in the crucible of eternal combat. But uncertainty about whether what he was witnessing was the emergence of an ally powerful enough to help him finally end hell, or the birth of something that would replace hell as the universe's greatest threat. The question was answered when Hulk turned away from him and began walking toward the Foundry's exit, toward the passages that led deeper into the necropolis, toward where hell's true power waited, not attacking the Slayer, not even acknowledging him, simply moving toward more demons to destroy, because destruction was what Hulk did, and hell had more demons than anywhere else in existence. The Slayer followed, and behind them the Foundry collapsed into ruin, its systems dead, its production ended, another piece of hell's infrastructure reduced to useless rubble. They emerged into the necropolis proper as the realm's bells began to toll. The sound was not mechanical but biological, was the screaming of tortured souls, compressed into shapes that could generate noise, was the anguish of millions given purpose as an alarm system. The bells told all of hell that its inner sanctum had been breached, that enemies walked in the sacred spaces reserved for the lords and princes, that something unprecedented was occurring. The necropolis was hell's crown jewel, its seat of power, the place where the realm's architecture achieved its most perfect expression of suffering and domination. Palaces rose from fields of bones, each structure a monument to some ancient victory, some conquered world, some devoured civilization. Streets were paved with souls compressed into transparent glass so that footsteps literally walked upon the damned. The sky was a membrane of stretched skin that pulsed with arterial light, that wept blood in a constant rain that hissed when it touched the ground. Demons filled the streets, but these were not the mindless hordes of the outer levels. These were hell's elite, its chosen servants, creatures that had earned their place through power or cunning or sheer endurance across eons of competition. They wore armor forged from the bones of angels. They carried weapons blessed by entities whose names could not be spoken without breaking reality. They moved with confidence born from never having lost, from existing at the top of hell's hierarchy, from being the predators that even other demons feared. They saw Hulk and the Slayer enter their city, and they came to destroy the intruders with the absolute certainty of those who had never been challenged in their own domain. The battle that followed was not a skirmish or an ambush, but a war compressed into hours, a conflict that would have taken months or years in any mortal realm but unfolded at hyperspeed because every participant was beyond normal limits of strength and endurance. The streets became killing fields. The palaces became fortresses under siege. The entire necropolis transformed into a battlefield where the combatants were so powerful that their mere presence damaged reality. Hulk fought at the center of the storm, a green and black giant who had grown beyond his previous size, who now stood taller than some of Hell's architecture, who punched through palace walls and brought down structures that had stood for eons. Argent energy crackled around his fists, the absorbed power expressing itself through his attacks, creating explosions where his strikes landed that incinerated demons and carved craters in the supposedly indestructible streets. The Slayer moved through the chaos like a scalpel through flesh, finding weak points, exploiting gaps, killing with an efficiency that made Hulk's raw destruction look almost wasteful by comparison. But there was no competition between them, no rivalry or measuring of kills. They fought for different reasons, expressed different aspects of violence, and together created a complementary horror that Hell had no defense against. A Baron of Hell emerged from one of the largest palaces, a creature that had commanded legions, that had conquered dimensions in Hell's name, that wore armor etched with the names of every world it had personally destroyed. It saw Hulk and charged, moving with speed that belied its massive size, moving with the confidence of something that had never been physically overpowered in all its existence. Hulk met the charge head-on, fist against claw, strength against strength. The impact created a shockwave that shattered windows in every nearby palace, that sent weaker demons tumbling through the air, that cracked the soul-glass streets in a perfect circle around the point of contact. They grappled, each trying to overpower the other, muscles straining, tendons creaking, the very air around them heating from the energy being expended. The Baron was stronger than anything Hulk had fought since entering Hell, was powerful enough that it actually forced him back a step, actually made his feet slide on the glass street. Hulk roared and gamma radiation began to pour from his body in waves, began to react with the argent energy already saturating his cells, began to trigger another transformation. He grew again, muscles expanding beyond any reasonable density, bones thickening to support the increased mass, skin darkening further until it was almost pure black with only hints of green visible beneath. The Baron's confidence faltered. It felt Hulk's strength increasing in real time, felt itself being pushed back despite bringing all its demonic might to bear. It tried to disengage, tried to create distance and fight tactically rather than in a contest of pure strength. Hulk did not let go. He drove forward, his enhanced strength now greater than the Baron's, his rage feeding on the demon's attempt to retreat, his every instinct demanding that he destroy this thing that had dared to challenge him. He lifted the Baron overhead, a creature that massed several tons, lifted it like it weighed nothing and brought it down across his knee. The sound of the Baron's spine breaking was like a gunshot, sharp and final. The demon's body went limp, its systems shutting down, its consciousness fading as it experienced true death for the first time in its incomprehensible lifespan. Hulk threw the corpse aside and looked for the next target, looked for more things to break, because the rage was still building, still intensifying, still driving him forward. The Slayer watched this display while simultaneously fighting off 3 Hell Knights, his movements automatic, his weapons finding targets with mechanical precision. He saw Hulk growing stronger with each battle, saw the transformations accelerating, saw power escalating beyond what should be possible even in Hell where impossible was the baseline. A thought occurred to him, cold and tactical, the kind of calculation that had kept him alive through countless wars. At some point, Hulk would become too powerful to stop, would become a threat greater than any demon, greater than any lord or prince, possibly greater than the Dark Lord himself. And when that happened, if the Hulk's rage turned in the wrong direction, if his fury found a new target, if he decided that everything should be destroyed rather than just demons, then the Slayer would have to make a choice. But not now, not while demons still filled the streets, not while Hell still stood, not while they were still moving in the same direction, still destroying the same enemies, still serving the same immediate purpose, even if their ultimate goals might diverge. The Slayer holstered his weapon and drew his blade, the crucible flaring to life with holy fire, with power blessed by the seraphim and consecrated through eons of demon blood. He moved toward where Hulk was fighting, moved to support, not because support was needed, but because standing apart suggested eventual opposition, and he wanted to delay that eventuality for as long as possible. They carved through the necropolis side by side, and Hell's finest warriors died in hundreds, in thousands, in numbers that would have been victories for entire armies, but here were just the opening moves of a conflict that would reshape the realm's power structure. The Hell priests watched from their sanctum deep beneath the necropolis, watched through scrying portals that showed them every angle of the battle, every moment of destruction, every instance where their carefully crafted defenses failed against the combined assault. Their faces, what passed for faces on beings that had transcended most biological constraints, showed something approaching concern. The eldest priest raised a staff that crackled with concentrated argent, with power drawn from Hell's deepest wells, with energy that had been refined over eons into its most lethal form. It spoke in the language of creation and uncreation, spoke words that made reality flinch, spoke a summoning that drew upon contracts signed before the current universe's birth. The sanctum's floor began to glow, began to crack, began to birth something that Hell had held in reserve for only the most desperate circumstances, for threats that could not be overcome through conventional means, for enemies that required solutions outside the normal hierarchy of violence. What emerged was not a demon in any traditional sense. It was an amalgamation, a fusion of thousands of demons compressed and recombined at the molecular level, enhanced with argent saturation that exceeded safe limits, blessed with dark rituals that had cost entire civilizations to perfect. The creature had no fixed form but flowed like liquid metal, could reshape itself to counter any threat, could adapt its structure to neutralize any attack. The priests had built a perfect hunter, had created something specifically designed to kill the Doomslayer, and now they would turn it loose on both the Slayer and the Hulk, would let it evolve in real time to counter their strengths, would watch as it consumed and absorbed and became the ultimate expression of Hell's will to survive. They called it the Devourer, and they sent it up into the necropolis with a single command: end the threat. Hulk sensed it first, some instinct warning him that something different was approaching, something that registered as more dangerous than the endless stream of standard demons. He turned toward the source of the feeling and saw the Devourer flowing through the streets, saw it moving like a wave of mercury, saw it absorbing demons in its path and incorporating their mass into itself, growing larger with each addition. The Slayer's sensors picked up the anomaly seconds later, analyzed its composition, attempted to categorize its threat level, and found the numbers exceeding his armor's capability to measure. He had encountered similar creatures before, had fought amalgamations and chimeras and things that Hell had stitched together from nightmares. But this was different. This was more refined, more focused, more specifically designed to be unbeatable. The Devourer reached them and struck without preamble, without posturing or warning. It simply flowed forward and attacked, its body splitting into dozens of tendrils that lashed out with hypersonic speed, that struck with force enough to crack the soul glass streets, that carried argent energy in concentrations high enough to burn through standard armor. Hulk punched one of the tendrils and his fist went through it like hitting water, his blow finding no resistance, creating no damage. The tendril wrapped around his arm and began to pull, began to try to drag him into the Devourer's main mass, began to attempt absorption. Hulk roared and gamma radiation exploded from his body, exploded with enough intensity to create a visible sphere of green light, to flash heat the air to plasma temperatures, to momentarily overwhelm even the Devourer's adaptive capabilities. The tendril released him and withdrew, smoking, parts of its structure crystallized and breaking off like charred wood. The Devourer learned, adapted. Its next attack came from a different angle, came with tendrils that were now shielded against radiation, that had incorporated the lesson from its first failure and evolved a counter in seconds. The Slayer fired his BFG, the weapon's green sphere intersecting with the Devourer's mass and detonating in a blast that should have vaporized anything demonic. The creature absorbed the explosion, absorbed the argent energy, incorporated it into itself, and grew larger, grew denser, grew more dangerous from the very attack meant to destroy it. Hulk and the Slayer fought the Devourer through the necropolis streets, fought it as it continued to evolve, to adapt, to become more perfectly designed to counter their specific capabilities. It learned to dodge the Slayer's precision attacks. It learned to redirect Hulk's strength. It learned to resist their combined assault through constant adaptation, through evolution measured in seconds rather than generations. The battle was not going well. The Devourer drove them back, forced them to retreat through the necropolis, chased them with tendrils that had become blades, that had become hammers, that had become whatever weapon was most effective against their current defensive postures. It was winning through pure adaptation, through Hell's accumulated knowledge applied in real time, through the refinement of eons of warfare compressed into a single entity designed for one purpose. Hulk stumbled, one of the Devourer's tendrils catching his leg and pulling him off balance. He crashed into a palace wall, and the structure collapsed around him, buried him in tons of demon-forged architecture, pinned him beneath rubble that would have crushed anything less indestructible. The Slayer turned to help, to provide covering fire, while Hulk extracted himself, but the Devourer was already flowing toward the buried giant, was already preparing to engulf and absorb him while he was immobilized, was already calculating how Hulk's power could be incorporated and used to destroy the Slayer afterward. The Slayer made a decision. He armed every explosive he carried, every grenade and mine and charge that his armor held in reserve for desperate situations. He set them all to detonate simultaneously on a dead man's switch, linked to his armor's integrity. Then he charged directly at the Devourer, not trying to dodge or fight tactically, but simply running straight into its mass, letting it engulf him, letting it begin the process of absorption while his armor's systems counted down to detonation. The Devourer took the bait, flowed around the Slayer, began to break down his armor, began to penetrate the blessed metal, began to reach for the flesh beneath. Its entire mass concentrated on consuming this prize, on absorbing the Doomslayer himself and claiming his power, his weapons, his very essence. The dead man's switch triggered. Every explosive detonated at once, inside the Devourer's mass, at the exact moment when all of its structure was concentrated in one place, when its adaptation had focused entirely on consuming the Slayer and left it vulnerable to attack from within. The explosion was biblical in scale, was a miniature sun born inside the creature's body, was force and heat and shrapnel expanding at velocities that exceeded the Devourer's ability to adapt. It came apart, its carefully structured form disrupted, its molecular bonds shattered, its amalgamated consciousness fragmented back into the thousands of individual demons that had been compressed to create it. And those demons were already dead, were already burning, were already past the point where even Hell's regeneration could save them. The Slayer emerged from the blast zone with his armor half destroyed, with systems failing, with warnings scrolling across his visor too fast to read. But he was alive. And the Devourer was not. Hulk pulled himself from the rubble, stood to his full height, looked at the scattered remains of the creature that had nearly killed them both, looked at the Slayer standing in the center of the destruction with his armor smoking and damaged, and understood what had happened. The armored figure had sacrificed himself, had used his own body as bait, had accepted probable death to give Hulk time to recover, to give them both a chance to survive. For the first time since entering Hell, since transforming into his current state, Hulk felt something other than rage. Not gratitude exactly, not friendship, but recognition, acknowledgement, the sense that this being was not an enemy, was not a threat, was something that deserved respect even in the simplified worldview that Hulk's consciousness operated within. Hulk walked toward the Slayer, each step shaking the ground, each footfall a statement of intent. He stopped directly in front of the damaged warrior, towered over him by more than a meter, looked down at the visor that concealed whatever expression the Slayer might have had. Then Hulk raised one massive fist. The Slayer did not flinch, did not move, did not reach for his weapons. He stood perfectly still and waited to see what would happen, waited to learn if this moment would end in violence or something else entirely. Hulk's fist unclenched, became an open hand, extended in the universal gesture of partnership, of alliance, of two warriors acknowledging each other as equals. The Slayer took the offered hand, his gauntlet tiny in Hulk's palm, and they sealed an alliance that Hell would learn to fear above all other threats in its infinite existence. In the priest's sanctum, the eldest among them felt something it had not experienced in eons: despair. Not at the loss of the Devourer, though that was catastrophic. Not at the destruction of the necropolis, though that was unprecedented, but at the realization that these two forces had now formally allied, had moved from coincidental cooperation to deliberate partnership, had become something greater than the sum of their already overwhelming individual strengths. Hell had no protocol for this, had no backup plan, had no weapon or strategy or ritual that could counter two beings of this magnitude working in concert. Every calculation led to the same conclusion: Hell would fall. Not might fall, would fall. Unless something changed, unless some new factor entered the equation, unless the impossible became possible once more. The priest opened forbidden channels, reached into dimensions that Hell itself feared to touch, sent messages to entities that existed outside the normal hierarchy of damnation. It called for help in languages that predated existence, called for intervention from powers that had remained neutral in Hell's eternal wars, called for anything that might shift the balance before the Slayer and the Hulk reached the throne room where the Dark Lord himself waited. Distant in the void beyond dimensions, things heard the priest's call and began to move. Hulk and the Slayer walked through the shattered necropolis, walked past ruins they had created, walked over demon corpses that carpeted the streets in layers thick enough to obscure the soul glass beneath. The realm's bells had stopped tolling. The constant screaming that formed Hell's ambient noise had diminished to whispers. The entire realm seemed to be holding its breath, seemed to be waiting to see what would happen next. They reached the palace at the necropolis's heart, the structure where Hell's Dark Lord ruled from his throne of compressed souls, where the realm's ultimate power resided. The palace doors were 50 meters high, forged from metal that had never existed in mortal reality, inscribed with runes that described the death of universes in languages that killed the unprepared simply from being read. The Slayer examined the doors, calculated the best approach for breaching them, began planning the assault that would carry them into the throne room and into confrontation with Hell's supreme being. Hulk walked past him and punched the doors. The impact echoed through dimensions. The doors, which had stood for eons, which had been specifically designed to withstand any assault, which were supposed to be impregnable, shattered, broke into fragments that tumbled inward, that crashed into the palace interior, that cleared a path directly to the throne room. The Slayer looked at Hulk. If he could have smiled beneath the helmet, he might have. They entered Hell's throne room together, and the Dark Lord rose to meet them. The being that ruled Hell was difficult to describe, difficult to even perceive without training or enhancement. It existed partially outside normal dimensions, its true form too vast to be contained in any single space. Its consciousness spread across infinite instances of itself. What sat on the throne was just an avatar, just a focal point for power that stretched across realities. But even the avatar was terrifying, was tall enough that it had to bend to fit under the throne room ceiling, was armored in scales that had been stars before Hell had consumed them, carried weapons that were concepts given physical form, that were suffering and entropy and the inevitability of ending made tangible. The Dark Lord spoke, and its voice was the sound of worlds dying, was every scream ever uttered compressed into syllables. The Slayer responded by loading his shotgun, the mechanical sound of shells being chambered as clear and cold as a declaration of war. Hulk simply roared, the sound building from deep in his chest, building until it was not just noise but force, was pressure that made the throne room's architecture crack, was rage, given voice and direction and absolute focus. The Dark Lord laughed. It had faced the Doomslayer before, had fought him across dimensions and through eternities, had learned his patterns, his strengths, his very limited weaknesses. And this new creature, this green giant, was just biology, just flesh and rage without the divine enhancement that made the Slayer truly dangerous. Together they were certainly a threat, certainly more challenging than anything Hell had faced recently, but still conquerable, still ultimately finite against Hell's infinite resources. The Dark Lord was wrong. The battle began with the throne room exploding into violence so intense that reality itself began to fray at the edges, began to show cracks where the fabric of existence could not handle the forces being expressed. The Dark Lord moved with speed that should have been impossible for something so large, struck with power that carved trenches in the supposedly indestructible floor, fought with the skill of something that had been practicing warfare since before time had meaning. The Slayer met it with blessed weapons and divine rage, with precision born from eons of combat, with hatred so pure it had transcended emotion and become a fundamental force. He dodged strikes that would have vaporized planets, landed shots in gaps that existed for nanoseconds, created openings through sheer skill and experience. Hulk met it with strength that continued to grow, with rage that fed on the Dark Lord's power, with simple indestructibility that treated the ruler of Hell's attacks as annoyances rather than threats. He traded blows with a god and did not fall, absorbed energy that should have unmade him and converted it into more muscle, more mass, more power. The Dark Lord began to realize its miscalculation, began to understand that it was not fighting two separate opponents but a unified force, a partnership where each component covered the other's weaknesses, where the Slayer's precision and Hulk's power overlapped in ways that created something greater than simple addition. When the Dark Lord focused on the Slayer, Hulk struck its flank with fists that now glowed with absorbed argent energy, that now carried force enough to stagger even this ultimate demon. When it turned to face Hulk, the Slayer's blessed blade found joints in its armor, found weak points that had never been exploited, found ways to hurt something that had been invulnerable for epochs. The throne room shook. The palace above began to collapse. The entire necropolis trembled as the battle between these titans shook Hell's foundations, as forces that should never have met in direct combat struggled for dominance in a conflict that would determine the realm's future. The Dark Lord activated its true form, began to pull more of its essence into the Avatar, began to draw on power that it had held in reserve for only the most desperate circumstances. It grew larger, darker, more terrible. Its weapons multiplied. Its armor became absolute. It prepared to end this threat with maximum force, with everything that Hell could bring to bear compressed into a single apocalyptic assault. Hulk and the Slayer saw this escalation and responded in kind. The Slayer activated his crucible to maximum power, drew on every blessing the Seraphim had granted him, channeled every ounce of divine rage into his weapons and his will. Hulk's transformation continued beyond any previous limit, his body darkening to pure black, his eyes blazing with light that was gamma and argent, fused into something entirely new, his size increasing until he matched the Dark Lord's avatar in height. They attacked together, a perfect synchronization of blade and fist, of precision and power, of divine wrath and infinite rage. They struck as one being, as a single force with two expressions, as the ultimate counter to everything the Dark Lord represented. The Dark Lord's armor shattered, its weapons broke, its avatar began to come apart, unable to contain the damage, unable to regenerate fast enough to counter the sustained assault. It tried to retreat, tried to withdraw its essence back into the vast network of itself that existed beyond the throne room, tried to preserve its consciousness even as the avatar failed. Hulk caught it, grabbed the Dark Lord's essence as it tried to flee, grabbed it with hands that now glowed with power that Hell itself had provided, with strength that had been amplified by every demon killed, by every battle won, by every moment of rage expressed through violence. He held the ruler of Hell and would not let it escape. The Slayer drove his crucible into the Dark Lord's core, drove it through armor and flesh and essence, drove it deep into the fundamental being that had ruled this realm for time beyond measure. Holy fire erupted from the wound, blessed energy that was anathema to everything demonic, that burned with purifying flame that could not be extinguished or resisted. The Dark Lord screamed, a sound that echoed through every dimension it occupied, that reached across Hell and into the mortal realm beyond, that announced to everything that could hear that the impossible had occurred, that the ruler of eternal damnation was dying. Hulk tore its essence in half, using strength that exceeded any limit, that broke through defenses that had never been broken, that expressed rage in its purest and most destructive form. The Dark Lord's consciousness fragmented, its vast network of selves breaking apart, its power dispersing across dimensions as the central focus that held it all together was destroyed. Hell itself screamed. The realm began to collapse, its architecture losing coherence as the consciousness that had shaped it ceased to exist, its very physics beginning to fail as the will that had imposed order on chaos was removed. Passages folded into themselves, palaces imploded, the soul-glass streets cracked and shattered. The membrane sky tore open, revealing void beyond that rushed in to fill the space that Hell had occupied. The Slayer grabbed Hulk and activated emergency protocols, used the last of his armor's power to generate a portal, to tear open a path back to the mortal realm before Hell's collapse could consume them both. They fell through the portal as the throne room disintegrated around them, as the palace became rubble, as the entire necropolis was pulled into the void of Hell's unmaking. They emerged in the UAC facility on Mars, emerged into the Argent extraction chamber where this had all begun, where the dimensional breach had first opened and allowed Hulk to cross into Hell. They collapsed on the metal floor, both of them damaged beyond what should have been survivable, both of them pushed to absolute limits by the battle they had just survived. Samuel Hayden was waiting, his mechanical form standing over them, his sensors attempting to assess the extent of their injuries and finding the data overwhelming. He had watched the entire battle through Hellside cameras, had witnessed the impossible, had seen Hell itself die at the hands of two beings who should never have existed, should never have met, should never have allied. Hulk lay still, his body beginning to shrink, the transformation reversing as the rage faded, as consciousness returned to Bruce Banner and the Hulk retreated back into whatever space they shared within the same flesh. The gamma radiation and argent energy were draining away, returning his body to something closer to human scale, closer to the fragile scientist rather than the indestructible monster. The Slayer removed his helmet, and beneath it his face was human again, was the face of a man rather than a force of nature, was exhausted and scarred and bearing an expression that might have been satisfaction if he still had the emotional range for such things. Hayden looked at them both, looked at what they had accomplished, looked at the readings showing Hell's dimensional signature collapsing into nothing, into absence, into a space that no longer registered as existing in any meaningful sense. The Slayer and Bruce Banner remained on the facility floor for a long time, neither moving, neither speaking, both simply existing in the aftermath of violence that had reshaped fundamental reality. Around them, UAC personnel began to gather, began to whisper, began to process what they had witnessed through instruments and monitors. Bruce Banner stirred first, pushed himself up on trembling arms, looked at his hands and saw they were human-sized again, saw bruises and cuts that would heal normally, saw no trace of the green and black giant he had become. He looked at the Slayer, at the armored warrior who had fought beside him through Hell itself, who had trusted him enough to form an alliance with something as uncontrollable as the Hulk. The Slayer met his gaze and nodded once. Not gratitude, not friendship exactly, but acknowledgement between warriors, between beings who had shared the kind of combat that forged bonds beyond language or conventional understanding. Samuel Hayden's voice broke the silence, clinical and measured despite the magnitude of what he was saying. Banner laughed, a sound edged with hysteria, with the strain of consciousness trying to process experiences that were never meant to be remembered in human form. He had vague memories of the battles, fragments of sensation and rage and violence, but the details were blurred, were protected behind the wall between himself and the Hulk. The Slayer stood, his armor's systems beginning their repair cycles, his weapons automatically reloading and resetting to combat readiness, even though there was nothing left to fight. He looked at Banner, at the small human who could become something capable of matching the Doomslayer himself in sheer destructive capacity, and made a decision. He extended his hand again, this time in the human gesture rather than the giant's version Hulk had offered in Hell's ruins. Banner took it, and they shook, sealing an alliance that had been forged in the depths of damnation and would persist in the mortal realm, an understanding between two men who shared the burden of containing forces that could end worlds. In the weeks that followed, as the UAC studied the dimensional breach where hell had existed and found only void, as scientists struggled to explain how an entire realm could simply cease to exist, Banner worked with Hayden to understand what had happened to him in hell, how his body had absorbed and integrated Argent energy, how the Hulk had evolved beyond any previous transformation. The answers were incomplete, fragmentary, filtered through physics that barely applied to beings like the Hulk and the Slayer. But they learned that hell had fundamentally changed Banner, had left markers in his cells that persisted even in human form, had created a connection between gamma radiation and Argent energy that meant future transformations would be different, more powerful, more dangerous than anything that had come before. Banner struggled with this knowledge, struggled with the implications of having become something even more uncontrollable, even more capable of destruction. But the Slayer, in rare moments of communication, offered perspective that only someone who had lived with similar power for eons could provide. Power was not the problem, purpose was. Rage was not evil if directed at evil. Strength was not destructive if used to protect rather than dominate. The Slayer had been a man once, had been human before the Seraphim's blessing, before Hell's crusade had transformed him into an eternal weapon. He understood what Banner was experiencing, understood the weight of containing forces that transcended human scale. They trained together in the UAC facility's reinforced chambers, Banner learning to access the Hulk with more precision, the Slayer teaching techniques for channeling rage rather than being consumed by it. It was imperfect progress, halting and difficult, but it was progress nonetheless. And when the dimensional sensors detected new breaches opening, when demons that had survived Hell's collapse began emerging in remote locations, when it became clear that the war was not truly over but had simply entered a new phase, Banner and the Slayer were ready. They stood together on Mars, looking at readouts showing demonic incursions on Earth, seeing new threats emerging from whatever fragments of Hell had survived in pocket dimensions or parallel realities. The battle they had won was complete, but the war continued, would always continue, because evil did not end simply because one realm fell. Banner felt the Hulk stirring inside him, felt the rage beginning to build in response to the threat, felt gamma radiation beginning to flood his system in preparation for transformation. But this time it was different. This time there was direction to the rage, purpose to the power, a sense that what he was about to become was not just destruction but protection, not just violence but justice. He looked at the Slayer one more time, saw the warrior preparing his weapons, saw the eternal crusader readying himself for another campaign, and smiled. The transformation began, green spreading across his skin, muscles expanding, consciousness shifting from Banner to Hulk, but maintaining more connection than before, more unity of purpose. He grew to his full height, eyes glowing with the fusion of gamma and Argent that had become his new baseline, and he spoke for the first time since entering Hell, spoke with a voice that was deeper than any human could produce, but still intelligible, still controlled. The Slayer loaded his shotgun, the familiar mechanical sound as clear as agreement, as ready as any verbal confirmation. They stepped through a portal together, Banner and the Slayer, Hulk and the Eternal Warrior, two forces unified in purpose, and Earth's demons learned what Hell's legions had discovered, that when rage found righteousness, when strength served protection, when the unstoppable met the immovable and decided to walk in the same direction, nothing in any reality could stand against them. The story of their battles spread across dimensions, became legend in realms where warfare was eternal and power was the only currency that mattered. Demons spoke in whispers about the Green Titan and the Blessed Warrior, about the alliance that had ended Hell itself, about the two beings who fought not for conquest or domination but for the simple purpose of destroying evil wherever it emerged. And in laboratories across Earth, scientists studied the readings from Mars, studied the data showing Hell's collapse, studied the impossible mathematics of what had occurred when Bruce Banner's rage met Argent energy in Hell's depths. They could not fully explain it, could not recreate it, could not predict what it meant for humanity's future. But they knew one truth with absolute certainty. The universe had changed, had been reshaped by the meeting of forces that should never have existed, should never have allied, should never have succeeded in doing what they had done. Hell was gone, its dark lord was dead, its infinite legions were scattered and leaderless, and in the vacuum left by its absence, something new was emerging, something that combined mortal determination with transcendent power, human rage with divine purpose. The age of Hell's dominance was over, ended not by armies or weapons or carefully planned campaigns, but by two individuals who had refused to accept that some enemies were too powerful to defeat, some evils too entrenched to uproot, some battles too impossible to win. They had proven that impossible was just a word, that limits were suggestions rather than absolutes, that rage tempered by purpose could achieve what reason and planning could not. And as they fought across Earth's surface, defending humanity from the scattered remnants of Hell's former empire, they became more than warriors, more than forces of nature, more than the sum of their individual strengths. They became hope given form, proof that darkness could be beaten, evidence that evil was not inevitable, symbols of what could be achieved when the unstoppable chose to fight for something beyond destruction, when infinite rage found a worthy target in those who would prey on the weak. Samuel Hayden watched from Mars, his processors calculating the implications, his vast intelligence attempting to model what this meant for the future. He had manipulated Argent energy for years, had thought he understood power and how to harness it. But watching the Slayer and the Hulk fight together, watching them achieve what no force in history had accomplished, he realized that true power was not about control or manipulation or clever use of resources. True power was about purpose, about finding something worth fighting for and refusing to stop no matter the cost, about rage transformed into righteousness, strength channeled into protection, violence directed at those who deserved it rather than those who were vulnerable to it. The UAC would need to change, he realized, would need to abandon its attempts to weaponize Argent energy, to commodify Hell's power, to profit from forces that should never be commercialized. The Slayer and the Hulk had shown a better path, had demonstrated that power served best when it served others, when it protected rather than dominated. It was a lesson that took a being of Hayden's intelligence and experience to fully appreciate, a truth that could only be learned by witnessing what happened when two beings of ultimate power chose to be something other than conquerors. Years passed in the mortal realm, though time meant little to beings like the Slayer and the Hulk. They continued their campaign, continued hunting the remnants of Hell's empire, continued fighting demons wherever they emerged. The battles became smaller, less apocalyptic, as the demonic forces diminished without Hell's infrastructure to support them. But Banner and the Slayer never stopped, never rested for long, never allowed themselves to believe the war was truly over. They had learned through experience that evil was patient, that corruption could hide and wait and rebuild, that vigilance was the price of preventing the kind of catastrophe that Hell had represented. And in those years, Bruce Banner changed, not just physically, though the Hulk's baseline power continued to increase through exposure to residual Argent energy in demon attacks, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. The rage that had defined the Hulk for so long began to acquire nuance, began to develop into something more sophisticated than simple anger at being threatened. The Hulk learned to hate injustice specifically rather than threats generally, learned to be angry at cruelty rather than just violence directed at him, learned to channel rage toward protection of the vulnerable rather than simple self-defense. It was a transformation that Banner had never thought possible, a development he could trace directly to fighting alongside the Doomslayer, to learning from a being who had perfected the art of righteous fury, who had spent eternities refining rage into a tool for good rather than a force of destruction. They stood together on a hill overlooking a city they had just saved from demonic incursion, stood in silence as emergency vehicles rushed toward the affected area, as human authorities began the process of containment and cleanup, as life slowly returned to normal in the wake of crisis. Banner, in human form, spoke softly. The words were inadequate, were too small to capture what he meant, but they were all he had. The Slayer did not respond verbally. He never did. But he reached out and gripped Banner's shoulder briefly, a gesture that conveyed more than words could, that acknowledged the bond they had formed through shared combat, through mutual respect, through the simple fact that they had fought through hell together and emerged stronger for it. Then he turned and walked away, his armor's systems already scanning for the next threat, his weapons ready, his purpose unchanged and unchanging. The eternal crusade continued, the war against evil persisted, and the Doomslayer would fight it until the end of time if necessary, would never rest, would never surrender, would never accept that darkness could triumph. Banner watched him go, felt the Hulk stirring inside him in recognition, in acknowledgement of a kindred spirit, in respect for a warrior who embodied everything the Hulk aspired to be when rage served purpose rather than self. He transformed, letting the Hulk emerge not from anger but from choice, from decision, from the understanding that this form was not a curse but a tool, not a punishment but a gift that came with responsibility. The transformation was smoother now, more controlled, the boundary between Banner and Hulk becoming less absolute as they learned to work together rather than fighting for dominance. Hulk leaped after the Slayer, crossing kilometers in a single bound, landing beside the armored warrior as they moved toward the next crisis, the next battle, the next moment where their power would be needed to prevent catastrophe. And across the world, in the shadows where demons still lurked, in the depths where evil still plotted, word spread of the alliance that had ended hell, of the two forces that fought as one, of the Green Titan and the Blessed Warrior who had become symbols of everything that darkness feared. They fought not for glory or recognition, not for reward or compensation, but for the simple reason that fighting was what they did, was what they had become through pain and rage and the crucible of endless combat. They fought because there was no one else who could, because the power they possessed came with obligations they could not ignore, because walking away would have meant abandoning everything they had learned about purpose and righteousness and the proper use of strength. They fought, and in fighting became more than warriors, more than forces of nature, more than the individuals they had been before hell had brought them together. They became legends, became myths, became the answer to the question that had plagued humanity since the first demon had crossed into mortal reality. What do you do when evil seems unstoppable, when darkness appears inevitable, when the enemy is too powerful to defeat through conventional means? You find beings who are stronger than evil, who are more unstoppable than darkness, who refuse to accept defeat regardless of how impossible victory appears. You find the Doomslayer and the Hulk, and you point them at the problem, and you watch as they solve it through simple application of rage and righteousness, refined into the purest expression of protective violence the universe has ever witnessed. That was the answer. That was the solution. That was what happened when unstoppable rage met infinite determination, and they decided to fight for the same purpose. Hell had learned this truth too late to save itself. Earth learned it just in time to survive. And the universe would remember it for as long as stories were told about the war that ended damnation itself, about the alliance that should never have existed, about the day when the Hulk came into Doom and everything changed forever.